This is the parable of Tom the Peacock, a woeful tale of demotivation.
Once upon a time, there was a young peacock named Tom. He was a fine, healthy bird who had just come of age and was now sporting a tail of 6 large and lustrous feathers. He was so proud of his tail. Whenever he felt nervous or uncertain, all he had to do was look at his magnificent feathers to feel a powerful surge of self-confidence. Tom awoke one morning full of eagerness and anticipation. This was his first day of work at the Oolong-tailed Teabag Company. Like most young peacocks, Tom had big plans for his future. He wanted to get a nest of his own, marry the peahen of his dreams, and raise a family. Starting this new job was the first step in achieving those dreams. Wanting to make a good impression, Tom carefully groomed each feather. As he studied his tail, he once again felt that surge of confidence and hope. He really brought a lot to this new job, he reflected. He worked well with other peacocks, was intelligent, and very creative. He had a positive attitude, could learn any task, and was really ready to make his mark on the world. Yes, he thought to himself as he gave his tail one final polish, they're lucky to have a bird like me going to work for them. When Tom arrived at the factory, the Peacock Resources Director introduced him to the foreman. This is Tom. As you can see, he brings a fine tail to this organization, and we think he'll go far. The foreman led Tom to his new position in the drying area. In this step of the manufacturing process, the tea was dried in huge ovens before it was weighed and put into bags. Tom looked around with awe. "Look at those mountains of tea," he murmured to himself. "I never realized there was so much tea in all the world." Indeed, there was a lot of tea waiting to be dried, and the peacocks charged with drying it were all moving at a frantic pace to meet their quota. There wasn't time for any training, not even safety training, though the oven glowed red with heat. Tom was given a shovel and told to start loading the oven with tea leaves. Tom worked hard, but because he was new and untrained, he wasn't able to work as efficiently as the others. "Hurry it up, bird brain," squawked the foreman. Tom hurried it up, but became less careful. A minute later, when the oven door clanged shut, Tom felt a pull from behind. He knew with a sickening sureness what had happened. One of his beautiful tail feathers had been caught in the oven door. "Help me!" cried Tom. His co-workers raced to open the oven door, but it was too late. The tail feather had been completely vaporized, leaving only a blackened stump. To add insult to injury, the stench of the burning feather permeated the tea leaves, ruining the entire batch. The foreman was furious. He cared little about Tom's lost feather and much about the wasted batch of tea leaves. The tongue-lashing Tom received made the mangled stump of his tail feather wither and drop to the floor. Being young and inexperienced, Tom accepted the blame. It didn't even occur to him that the lack of training and frenzied pace demanded by the quota might be the real cause of the accident. He took his lumps and vowed to himself that one day he would make up for it. Tom spent more time in the drying department, and he eventually did get better at the work, but he remained fearful of the ovens, and his performance suffered as a result. Eventually, he was transferred to the tea weighing area. His new job was weighing tiny piles of tea so that the proper amount would be used in each tea bag. It was a decent enough job. He got to sit down, and it was a lot easier than shoveling tea. The main problem with this work was that the scales used to weigh the tea were very old and inaccurate. It didn't take Tom long to realize that, with an accurate scale, he could quickly measure the exact amount of tea for each bag and would save the company more tea than he had ruined with his burnt feather. Excited with this thought, Tom called his new foreman over and explained his idea. He thought the foreman would be impressed with the suggestion, but he was wrong. "Of all the cockamamie ideas," the foreman screeched, "I've been the foreman of this line for over 10 years, and if there was a better way, I'd already know about it." In his indignant fury, the foreman grabbed Tom and shook him so hard that another of his beautiful feathers fell to the floor. Tom was devastated. Another feather lost, and for what? He sadly went back to his old inaccurate scale and tried to do the best he could with it. While he worked, he looked around at the other peacocks working in the factory. He saw that most of them were missing tail feathers, especially the more senior ones. The feathers they still had seemed oddly dull. Tom pondered the situation and decided that missing feathers must be a sign of experience. Even so, it just made him sick to imagine his wonderful tail being so reduced. The foreman never forgave Tom for suggesting that his line could be improved, so when the opportunity arose, Tom was quickly transferred to the tea bag packing area. In this job, Tom put the pre-weighed tea into the bags and stapled them closed. The bags were slippery and the stapler was bulky, but Tom did his best. Eventually, he figured out a way to fill the bags faster and with less spillage. After his last experience, he kept this knowledge to himself, but soon his productivity far exceeded that of his coworkers, and the foreman noticed. This foreman didn't resent Tom for his improvement. No, this foreman became dissatisfied with all the other peacocks who were filling tea bags less efficiently than Tom. He berated them constantly to work harder. And knowing that Tom was the cause of this added pressure, his coworkers grew angry with him. One day, they waited for him in the parking lot and really kicked his tail for raising the foreman's expectations. Tom lost a third feather to a really solid boot. Tom was beside himself. "What peahen will want to marry a peacock with only half a tail?" he moaned. He really didn't know what he should do differently to preserve his remaining feathers, but he knew he had to do something. Sometime later, Tom was scheduled for his first performance review. He was really hoping for a raise so he could move out of the family nest and get a place of his own. Ever hopeful, Tom carefully cleaned and polished his remaining tail feathers in preparation for the review. Unfortunately, the performance review was entirely focused on the problems he'd experienced in the past. He'd wasted an entire oven load of tea. He'd moved around from job to job. He couldn't get along with his foreman, and when he couldn't get along with his coworkers. What in the world, the supervisor wanted to know, was wrong with him? Of course he wasn't getting a raise. He should consider himself lucky not to be fired. Poor Tom. After that review, his tail was really dragging. It was no real surprise that one of his feathers got caught in the door as he left the office. Down to his last 2 feathers, Tom decided his best bet was to lay low. He'd keep his ideas to himself, and he'd limit his production to match that of his coworkers. He sure didn't want to risk losing any more of his tail feathers by attracting attention to himself. The work was tedious and frustrating. That stapler was terrible. It didn't staple when he wanted it to, but always seemed to staple when it wasn't supposed to. The feathers he had left began to look dull and dusty. Tom avoided looking at his tail now. Instead of filling him with pride and confidence as it had once done, it now filled him with shame and sadness. For the first time, Tom became afraid. He fed on every rumor he heard. Possible plant closings, layoffs, reorganizations all filled him with a vague sort of terror. He got so jumpy worrying about those phantoms that he quit paying attention to his work and accidentally stapled one of his feathers to a tea bag. Poor Tom was down to his last feather and about at the end of his rope. A few weeks later, Tom saw a sign on the bulletin board announcing the annual holiday party. He asked around and learned that, in addition to a big banquet, the company awarded bonuses during the party. Bonuses? Hey, he hadn't gotten a raise, but he had worked hard. Maybe he would get a bonus. His single remaining tail feather twitched in anticipation. The night of the party, Tom sat with his coworkers at a large banquet table. There was a special table for the company executives at the front of the room. Tom watched with awe as they entered the room. "Look at those tremendous tails," he thought to himself. Tom glanced at his own bedraggled tail and knew that he was totally outclassed by those magnificent birds. He felt small and somehow rather dirty. Each of the factory workers got a can of feather polish for their bonus, while the executives received feather extensions, feather spa vacations, and various other awards with which they could feather their nests. Tom looked mournfully at his can of polish. At least, with only 1 feather left, the polish would last a long time. With that thought, Tom's final tail feather drifted to the floor. He put his head in his wings and began to cry. How had this happened to him? He remembered when he first started work, he was so proud and confident. He'd had such vigor and excitement. The dreams and goals he'd set for himself now seemed totally beyond his reach. Little by little, everything had somehow been plucked away. Totally despondent, Tom left the table and wandered aimlessly through the banquet hall. He ended up near the kitchens. When the head chef saw him, he noted Tom's featherless state and thought the main course was escaping. The chef grabbed a handy frying pan and hit Tom on the head, knocking him cold. The chef carried him into the kitchen where he was stuffed, roasted, and served for dinner. As the executive peacocks passed the platter, the Peacock Resources Director leaned towards the manufacturing director and asked, "Whatever became of that Tom fellow? He had a lot of potential." Poor Tom's goose was cooked long before he actually ran into the chef. Like many others at Oolong, Tom was beaten down by a production-driven system of managing that did little or nothing to reinforce his initial feelings of personal worth and importance. Rather than reinforcing Tom's capabilities and desire to contribute, Oolong managed, through a series of non-supportive actions, to systematically pluck Tom's self-esteem. Under Oolong's management system, Tom and his co-workers were treated as just another tool to get out production. There was no time or inclination for training, equipment maintenance, listening to new ideas, or improving operating processes. Tom paid the ultimate price, but it was obvious from the dull feathers of his co-workers that no can of polish could possibly compensate for the inherent weaknesses of the work environment created by Oolong. Instead of encouraging initiative, innovation, and involvement through a set of management practices that promote workers' self-esteem and quality of life, Oolong's system of managing actually transformed hope into despair and confidence into fear. Even if Tom had escaped the chef, he would have become increasingly diminished by the system. His goal, ultimately, would have been mere survival, the most basic and least productive motivator.
Please go to our website at epictransformations.com for more information. Thank you.